Hi class, this is lesson 13, video 2. I felt like I hurried the last one, but my timer was running out. I had to delete a bunch of files from my phone in order to make room for another video. So anyway, uh, some details. I like to go over the case and talk about, the Alpha Chi Omega and the sweaters. But now I want to talk to you a little bit more about the law and how the law applies to something like a non-conforming delivery. Again, point from before, all contracts for the sale of goods are governed by Article 2 of the Uniform Commercial Code. Remember, the Uniform Commercial Code, or the UCC, is a law drafted by committees of lawyers and judges, and then it's passed and signed into law right now in 49 states. I think the Louisiana does not follow the UCC. But the point of the law is that it makes commercial transactions, and those are sales in which at least one party is a merchant. Okay, so even just one party, remember, so you could be the consumer, but if you go to Home Depot and you buy a hammer, well, Home Depot's a merchant, so that, and a hammer is a good because it's portable. So that sale is governed by the Uniform Commercial Code, Article 2, governing the sale of goods. And it's a commercial transaction because Home Depot is a commercial party, even though you're a consumer. And of course, you could be the CEO at, I don't know, Lowe's, but if you're shopping at Home Depot, you in that role, you are a consumer. You're not a commercial party. You're just buying something for yourself. Anyway, the commercial transactions are governed by the Uniform Commercial Code, and the goal of the UCC is to make uniform, okay, to make the same the rules. So we're trying to make the same rules for every state. So they want the rules for commercial transactions to be uniform across the country because it makes it so much easier to do business. If, for example, the law in Texas is the same as it is in Louisiana, or I mean in Oklahoma, for example, or New Mexico, well then businesses in New Mexico and Oklahoma and Texas can make buy and sell and conduct business and not have to worry about what's going to be different about whether this contract is governed by your state law or our state law. So the UCC provides that the state law generally matches, although the Texas or any state could agree to the Uniform Commercial Code, but maybe make one exception or another exception. But they try to keep it as much uniformity as possible. That's why they call it uniform. And then, it's a commercial code because it applies to commercial parties like businesses. But again, Louisiana is not a party. Anyway, the UCC requires the parties to determine the terms of their own contracts. What's the quantity of the purchase? What's the price? What are the payment arrangements? Is there a down payment and then pay the balance later? We're going to pay over 3 months, 6 months, 2 years, financing, whatever you want to do. That stuff should be in the contract. However, also delivery. I didn't mention delivery. Also, however, if the parties do not address all those different terms, the Uniform Commercial Code can supply the missing terms. The parties are obligated to act in good faith, but if there is a dispute about terms, the UCC can supply terms by default. I got a little box here that I like in red, and it says the UCC, or Uniform Commercial Code, makes commercial transactions, and those are sales in which at least one party is a merchant. It makes commercial transactions uniform from one state to the next. Okay, same definition I was trying to give you a minute ago. Now, let's talk in more detail about the duty of the seller, and then in the next video we'll talk about the duty of the buyer. Okay, as in the Alpha Chi Omega sorority case, the seller, what was that guy's name? Furlong, it's a measurement at sea, right? Furlong had a duty of timely delivery of conforming goods. Okay, I'll say it again. His duty as a seller is the duty of timely delivery of conforming goods. Those goods should have conformed to the order. Okay, now number one, I just numbered my notes. What is timely? Well, the parties can stipulate timing for delivery in the contract. Um, if the time for delivery is not stated, well, then the UCC default is going to be like a reasonable time. Okay. Well, what's reasonable? The court will apply good faith and accepted commercial standards. And if the parties do not agree, the UCC can supply some delivery terms. And now here are timing terms, timing of delivery. Here's an example. When you go to court, the judge is going to make a default assumption or kind of a gap filler rule. They call these terms gap filler terms. Here's an example. The firewood was to be delivered on the day before the guests arrived at the cabin. Now, how does a judge decide what those gap filler terms are? Well, he's going to look at the terms of the contract and basically like try to make sense of the contract. You want to take a contract and make sure that it works. Okay? He'll look at the terms of the contract and he'll reject terms or gap filler terms that would make the contract fail. If the contract involved providing a mountain cabin whose only heat source was a wood stove, and like maybe an Airbnb arrangement, you were going to rent a cabin in the wintertime up in the woods somewhere, and you're going to heat that cabin by putting firewood into a wood stove, okay? And if you get there and there's no firewood, then how are you going to heat the cabin, right? It's going to ruin your weekend. So the judge is not going to say, oh, it's fine if you delivered firewood on Monday if the vacationers were going to arrive on Friday. The wood, I mean the Friday before, the wood has to be there in time for them to use it, okay? I mean, it just doesn't make sense. So the way the law works, and judges and lawyers know, I mean, you try to make a contract make sense. That's the simplest way to look at a contract. It should make sense. And if the parties appear to maybe they're not telling the truth or something, sometimes the way to sort that out is to say whose lie, whose story makes the most sense, And maybe under one arrangement, it's like, yeah, you would have put the firewood in the cabin and then they show up the next day. That makes sense. If they show up, they spend 3 days cold and they go home and then the firewood gets delivered, that doesn't make sense, okay? I mean, that's not reasonable. So the UCC will provide gap filler terms such as the next business day. If that day it won't provide terms like next business day if that next business day is a Monday and the weekend holiday at the cabin's already over. That doesn't make sense. So the judge wouldn't pick that kind of a day for a gap filler term. And again, gap filler means there was a gap in the contract. They didn't discuss the date. And so it's kind of obvious. I mean, it'd be in an Airbnb arrangement, although you do it online, but let's just say if you were making a phone call and setting up a lodging somewhere, it's a wood stove, it's whatever. You might not think about firewood, You might have been there the year before and there was firewood on the porch 3 feet high for 25 feet long, I mean, I've seen firewood like that. It was like, how many trees is that, So maybe you expect it's going to be that way again and you don't discuss it. It doesn't matter whether you discussed it. The UCC can fill in the gap, the missing term that was never discussed in the contractual arrangement, because you just assumed, of course, there's got to be firewood, it'd be cold. It was kind of a reasonable assumption, especially if you'd been there before. But the UCC won't fill in a day like next business day if that means Monday, and it ruins the whole point of the vacation. As I've said so often, the law wants to make it easier to conduct business. The law wants to make it easier for parties to engage in commerce. That means the law will be read in such a way that contracts are going to make sense. So UCC gap filler terms must be applied in a way that makes the contract work. Making the timing of the firewood delivery happen on Friday morning or maybe Thursday before the guests check in, that is reasonable, okay? And that would demonstrate good faith on the part of the landlord or the Airbnb host. By the way, we talked about a lot of this stuff in the legal environment of business. I know Dr. Lee Usnick and some of the other professors really, really spend a lot of time on the UCC. I probably don't spend as long as some of the others, but I mean, we've had this discussion before in the legal environment business. Ironically, I can say that in my years practicing law, I don't think I ever worked on anything involving the Uniform Commercial Code, but that's because most of my work was as a litigator. I mean, it was mostly litigation. It wasn't really drafting contracts or anything like that. And the litigation usually was, big time commercial problems or big business, huge business fights, usually about insurance and stuff like that. Anyway, okay, what about the location of the delivery? Well, the parties could agree on it and write it down and talk to each other, but if they don't, again, the UCC can supply a missing term. Okay, let's talk about different kinds of contracts. There's delivery it can happen different ways. Title passes to the buyer when the shipper has completed his delivery obligations under the contract. I think we talked about that in the case of just very recent case in this class, the one about the bicycle. And then there was a blackout in New York City, and he bought the bicycle, and they told him it was available, but he didn't pick it up until the blackout was over, and the bicycle during the blackout, the bicycle was stolen. So legal title had never passed to the buyer because he had never picked up the good. Okay. Anyway, this is that kind of rule we're looking at now. When does title pass? Title passes to the buyer when the seller's completed all his delivery obligations. Now, there's three types of contracts. There's a shipment contract, destination contract, and then there's contracts wherein the goods are in the possession of the bailee and they're not going to be moved, which is like that bicycle. It's still at the store, or whatever, just come get it. Okay, here are the rules for each. Number one, in a shipment contract. In a shipment contract, the seller has 4 duties. Deliver the goods to a carrier like maybe UPS or Amazon's, Prime, whatever delivery. Or B, deliver goods with a reasonable contract for transportation. Or C, deliver goods with proper documentation for the buyer. And then D, promptly notify the buyer about the delivery. Okay? So the seller has to deliver the goods to a carrier, deliver the goods with a contract in place for their transportation, deliver the goods with documentation for the buyer, like a receipt, and then promptly notify the buyer of the delivery. Let them know. Then the second type of contract is a destination contract. In a destination contract, the seller has 2 duties. Deliver the goods to the destination at the buyer's disposal, and then B, provide appropriate documents, like a receipt again, that says it's delivered. And then finally, there's the goods in possession of the bailee that are not going to be moved. Unless the parties stipulate otherwise, the UCC dictates that delivery is accomplished when the seller gives the buyer a negotiable document of title, or when the bailee, that's usually the seller who's still holding the item, when the bailee acknowledges the buyer's right to take the goods. And under the UCC, if the bailee acknowledges your right to take the goods, then delivery is accomplished. Now, finally, another point, if nothing is said about delivery, the UCC default rule is that delivery will happen at the seller's place of business or his residence if he has no place of business. And now that's a little weird one because this is the Uniform Commercial Code and we're talking about merchants. How many merchants are operating out of their house and don't have a place of business? But I guess that's more and more common all the time now with some of the internet businesses. The UCC applies if either party is a merchant, and even in this case, I guess the buyer could be a merchant. Now we were talking again, and I'm going to talk some more. What are conforming goods? You heard the term conforming. Like I told you before, you got to make timely delivery of conforming goods. Well, when I hear the word conforming, I don't know why, but I always think about conformation, like in an animal show. You ever watch the dog show on TV? Or, there's horse shows, there's cattle shows, there's FFA, 4-H. Anybody in class that was in the FFA or 4-H. My kids, right out here, we had goats. We had we didn't show horses. We had horses, but anyway, we've actually got a blue heeler dog that was the son of a show dogs. But they did do FFA, and they showed goats, I think, and rabbits. Well, anyway, animals have this. There's a conformation. There's like a whole little map of the animal's body, and what do the ears look like, and what do the feet look like, and what does the tail look like, and everything has to be in certain conformation. I got a picture here. It says, and my words say, show animals are expected to conform to a standard for their breed, whether they're cattle, chickens, goats, dogs, or whatever. And I got a great picture from the American Quarter Horse Association. I mean, there's all these little parts of the horse's body, and there's the details of what every single part should look like, in this case on a quarter horse, which is a uniquely American breed, by the way. Well, that's what we're talking about. That's conformation with animals, show dogs and whatnot. Well, same thing in your ordering in business. If you order sweaters with 5 different colors in the logo, you want the delivery of sweaters to match, to conform to your order. And that Furlong, the guy in the Alpha Chi Omega story, he did not make conforming delivery. It was timely, but it was not conforming. Okay, so the goods a seller delivers must conform to the buyer's order. Here's a passage from your text, and I'm going to just read it to you because it's well done. The parties may agree on what conforming goods means. An order will specify large grade A eggs, and that means something in the business. Or an order might specify 20 gross 100 count boxes, number 8 by, my fire truck's going to go by, number 8 by 3/8 by 32 Phillips flathead machine screws. That would be, again, that's an order. Someone could order 20 gross of 100 count boxes of number 8 by 3/8 by 32 Phillips head machine screws. That is a screw with a designated diameter, length, number of threads per inch, and a unique cruciform head insert to take a particular kind of driver. The buyer might, for example, agree to purchase seconds, which are goods with some kind of flaw, such as clothes with seams that are not sewed quite straight, or food that's slightly past its pull date. The parties may also agree in the contract what's going to happen if non-conforming goods are delivered. You might say, here's what I want, but if you do deliver non-conforming goods, these are my options. And that you just go ahead and put that in the contract. Sounds like a more sophisticated buyer, like you've been doing this a long time, and you've like, look, here's our deal, but if you breach, I'm going to do this with the non-conforming goods, or you're going to give me some money back, or whatever. Well, if goods are delivered that do not conform, then the buyer can reject the goods and seek to rescind the contract. Or the buyer can ask the seller to make it right. Often the two parties will find a way to settle on some kind of compromise. But if conforming goods is not defined, in other words, if there is no detailed order for the goods to conform to, then the UCC default rule kicks in, and the seller must make perfect tender. Again, tender kind of means delivery. That is, what is delivered must in every respect conform to the contract. Well, but what if what's delivered does not conform? Well, then the buyer's not obligated to accept or pay. Okay? So the buyer is not obligated to pay unless the seller makes perfect tender. What about failure of perfect tender? Let's look at that for a second. If the seller fails to make a perfect tender, the seller is in material breach of the contract. However, the seller does have a right to cure. And then again, this is another passage from your book, and I'm just going to read it. Before the defaulting seller is in complete default, she has a right to cure. Here's what the UCC says in Section 2-508. Number 1, where any tender or delivery by the seller is rejected because non-conforming because it's non-conforming and the time for performance has not yet expired, the seller may reasonably notify the buyer of his intention to cure and may then, within the contract time, make a conforming delivery. Okay, so you have time if you can get it done. Go ahead and fix it. Number two, where the buyer rejects non-conforming tender, which the seller had reasonable grounds to think would be acceptable, like they maybe had a misunderstanding. So the seller thought this was conforming and the buyer says, no, no, no. Well, then the seller may, if he seasonably notifies the buyer, he might get a further reasonable time to substitute a conforming tender. In other words, maybe the seller can take another bite at the apple. So number one, if time has not run out, the seller may notify the buyer that the seller intends to cure by making conforming delivery. But two, if time has run out, but the seller reasonably believed delivery was conforming, well, then the seller may have, quote, a further reasonable time to substitute conforming tender. So if time has run out, but the seller believed that delivery was good enough, the seller might get a little bit more time to go ahead and try to make it better. Here are some examples of each. And again, the book, sometimes it's well written. Buyer orders Santa Claus candles delivered on November 5th. On October 25th, they delivered the goods, but they're not right. They're Christmas angels instead of Santa Claus. But the seller still has 11 days to cure. So the buyer must allow the 11 days. Buyer places an order exactly the same as the first order, and the order arrives on November 5th in the original manufacturer's packaging, but they're not right. Well, says the seller, I thought they'd be okay out of the package. I'll get the correct ones to you right away. Then the buyer would have a duty to allow that. So I read this kind of quickly. It's two different things. In the first one, they delivered angels instead of Santas, but it's 11 days early. They definitely have the rest of that 11 days to get the right order delivered. Okay? And then the second example, they delivered something, I don't know, candles, whatever, but it's not candles, it just, whatever it is, it's still in the original manufacturer's packaging rather than being like unwrapped and repackaged. And the seller says, oh, I thought that'd be okay. I didn't understand. I'll get you what you want. And then the buyer would have a duty to allow it because the seller made kind of a reasonable mistake with not following what the buyer was going to want. Okay.